Maya Chen was just 17 years old, but her fingers could create magic on the piano keys. She wasn't born into a wealthy family with music rooms and private tutors. No, her story was different. She grew up in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of an old building, where the elevator only worked half the time. Her mother worked as a nurse, pulling double shifts at the local hospital just to make ends meet. Money was always tight. There were months when they had to choose between fixing the leaking kitchen sink or buying new sheet music. But one thing never changed. In the corner of their small living room sat an old upright piano that took up almost half the space. That piano was Maya's whole world. She got it when she was just 4 years old. Her grandmother had passed away and left it to them. It wasn't fancy. Some of the keys stuck. The wood was scratched and faded. But to little Maya, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. From the very first day she touched those keys, something clicked. Her mother noticed it right away. While other kids her age were playing with dolls or watching cartoons, Maya would sit at that piano for hours. She taught herself simple melodies by ear before she could even read music properly. By the time she was 7, her elementary school music teacher called her mother in for a meeting. The teacher's hands were shaking with excitement as she spoke. She told Maya's mother that her daughter had a gift, a real natural talent that showed up maybe once in a lifetime. She recommended getting Maya proper lessons, even though she knew money was an issue. Maya's mother took on extra weekend shifts. She cut back on everything she could. No new clothes for herself. No eating out. No small luxuries. Every extra dollar went toward Maya's piano lessons with Mr. Johnson, a retired concert pianist who lived 3 blocks away. Mr. Johnson was strict but kind. He saw the fire in Maya's eyes, that hunger to learn and improve. He often gave her lessons for half price, sometimes even for free, because he believed in her potential. He'd tell her mother, "This child is special. I've taught piano for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone with this combination of technical skill and emotional understanding at such a young age." The years flew by. Maya practiced every single day after school, no matter what. Tired from exams? She practiced. Friends invited her to hang out? She practiced for an hour first, then joined them. Sick with a cold? She'd practice gentle pieces that didn't require too much energy. The piano wasn't just her hobby. It was her purpose, her voice, her way of expressing everything she felt inside. By age 12, she entered her first real competition. She was nervous, her hands sweating as she waited backstage. But the moment she sat at that grand piano and started playing, everything else disappeared. She won first place. Then she won the next competition. And the next one. Every regional competition she entered, she came home with a trophy or medal. Local newspapers started writing about her. They called her a prodigy, a rising star in the classical music world. People in her neighborhood recognized her. Her school was proud of her. But Maya stayed humble. She knew she was lucky to have this gift, and she never wanted to waste it or take it for granted. When she turned 16, her dream seemed closer than ever. She wanted to study at a top music conservatory, maybe even perform with professional orchestras someday. But she knew the path wasn't easy. There were thousands of talented young pianists out there, all fighting for the same opportunities. Then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. Maya came home from school to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands. Her mother's eyes were red and puffy. For a terrible moment, Maya thought something bad had happened, but then her mother looked up and smiled through her tears. "You've been invited," her mother whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Masters of Music, they want you on the show." Maya's heart stopped. Masters of Music wasn't just any show. It was the show. The most prestigious classical music television program in the entire country. Musicians from around the world dreamed of performing on that stage. Conservatory directors watched it. Concert promoters watched it. Record label executives watched it. One good performance could open doors that might otherwise stay closed forever. The invitation said she'd been selected from thousands of applicants. They'd seen videos of her competitions. They were impressed. They wanted her to perform live on national television in 6 weeks. 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to choose the perfect piece. 6 weeks to practice until her fingers could play it in her sleep. Maya knew exactly what she wanted to perform. Chopin's Etude in C-sharp minor, Opus 10, No. 4. It was one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. Fast, intense, requiring incredible finger independence and stamina. But it was also beautiful, emotional, telling a story through its cascading notes. Some people thought she was crazy for choosing such a difficult piece. Even Mr. Johnson raised his eyebrows when she told him. "Are you sure?" he asked. "That's a piece that challenges even concert pianists. You're still young. Maybe choose something a bit safer." But Maya shook her head. She didn't want safe. She wanted to show what she could really do. This was her one shot to be seen by the people who mattered in the music world. She wasn't going to play it safe and blend into the background. She was going to take a risk. For the next 6 weeks, Maya lived and breathed that Chopin etude. She practiced it forward and backward. She practiced it with her eyes closed. She practiced individual sections hundreds of times until they were absolutely perfect. Her fingers sometimes hurt so badly she had to ice them at night. But she never complained. This was what she wanted, what she'd worked her whole life for. Her mother supported her every step of the way. She'd sit in the living room while Maya practiced, sometimes falling asleep in her chair after her long hospital shifts, but always there, always believing in her daughter. The night before the show, Maya couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind running through every note of the piece. She was excited. She was terrified. She was ready. Tomorrow, her life might change forever. Tomorrow, the whole country would see what a girl from a small apartment with a scratched-up piano could do. She had no idea just how much that performance would actually change everything. But not at all in the way she expected. Viktor Antonov wasn't just famous in the classical music world. He was a legend, a giant, the kind of name that made young musicians feel both inspired and terrified at the same time. At 72 years old, he'd lived a life that most musicians could only dream about. Born in Eastern Europe, he'd been trained in the most prestigious conservatories. He'd conducted the Berlin Philharmonic, the London Symphony Orchestra, the Vienna Philharmonic. When he walked into a concert hall, people stood up. When he raised his baton, orchestras of 100 musicians followed his every tiny gesture. But Viktor Antonov was known for something else too. His personality, or maybe more accurately, his complete lack of patience for anything less than absolute perfection. He'd been a teacher at various music schools throughout his career, and the stories about him were legendary. Students talked about him in hushed, nervous whispers. There was the time he made a cellist repeat the same 4 measures for 3 hours straight. The time he threw a music stand across the room because someone came in half a beat late. The time he told a violinist she should consider a career in accounting instead because her vibrato was an insult to the instrument. He didn't do it to be cruel. At least that's what he told himself. He did it because he believed that classical music was sacred. It was the highest form of human artistic expression, and anyone who couldn't meet his standards simply didn't belong in the profession. In his view, he was doing them a favor by telling them the harsh truth early, before they wasted years of their life chasing an impossible dream. Better to crush their hopes now, he once said in an interview, than let them discover their mediocrity after decades of struggle. It was this philosophy, this brutal honesty, that made him perfect for television. 3 years ago, the producers of Masters of Music had approached him to be the lead judge on their show. At first, he'd refused. Television was beneath him. It was entertainment for the masses, not serious music appreciation. But they'd made him an offer he couldn't refuse. They gave him complete freedom to say exactly what he thought. No filters, no sugarcoating. They promised him that Masters of Music would be different from other talent shows. It would focus on real classical music, real technique, real artistry. And most importantly, they'd let him be himself. So he agreed. And the show became a massive hit. People tuned in every week, not just to hear beautiful music, but to see what Viktor Antonov would say. His critiques became legendary. Social media exploded after each episode with clips of his most savage moments. The show's ratings skyrocketed. But behind those ratings were real people, real musicians who'd spent their whole lives working toward their dreams, only to have them torn apart on national television in under 3 minutes. There was the soprano who sang a perfect aria. Not a single note wrong, but he stopped her halfway through. "Technically adequate," he'd said with a dismissive wave. "But your voice has no color, no character. You sound like a very expensive but boring machine." She'd left the stage in tears. There was the young violinist who'd traveled from across the country for his audition. He played beautifully but made one tiny mistake, barely noticeable. Victor stopped the performance immediately. If you cannot play it perfectly in front of an audience, you have no business being here. Next contestant, please. The boy's hands had shaken so badly afterward that he couldn't even pack his violin properly. There was the classical guitarist who'd composed his own piece, pouring his heart into every note. Victor listened for 45 seconds before holding up his hand to stop him. Original compositions from amateurs are almost always a waste of everyone's time. You've just proven my theory correct. The guitarist never performed publicly again. The other judges on the panel were accomplished musicians too, but they were gentler, more encouraging. They'd try to find something positive to say, try to offer constructive criticism, but their opinions barely mattered. Everyone knew that Victor Antonov's word was final. If he liked you, doors opened. If he didn't, well, you'd better have a backup career plan. Some people in the music community criticized him. They said he was destroying young talent, crushing spirits unnecessarily, creating a culture of fear instead of encouragement in classical music. They wrote opinion pieces about how his methods were outdated and harmful, but Victor dismissed all of it. The weak-minded need encouragement, he'd said in response to one article. The truly talented need only truth. If my words crush someone's spirit, then their spirit was too fragile for this profession in the first place. He truly believed that. In his 72 years, he'd seen thousands of musicians. Most of them were mediocre in his opinion. They could play the notes, sure. They'd practice their scales and their arpeggios, but they lacked that special something, that spark of genius that separated great musicians from everyone else. And to Victor, letting mediocre musicians believe they were good enough was the real cruelty. It was giving them false hope. It was setting them up for a lifetime of disappointment and failure. Better to be honest up front, even if that honesty hurt. The week before Maya's episode was set to film, the producers held their usual pre-show meeting. They went through the list of contestants who'd be performing. There was an opera singer, a jazz pianist, a classical guitarist, and Maya, the teenage pianist from the small town. This one's interesting, the producer said, pointing to Maya's file. 17 years old. Self-taught initially. Mother's a nurse. They don't have much money. She's won every regional competition in her area. She's chosen to play Chopin's Etude Opus 10 No. 4. Victor barely glanced up. Another teenager who thinks technical ability is the same as artistry. How predictable. You haven't even heard her yet, one of the other judges said carefully. Victor smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. I don't need to. I've heard 1,000 teenagers play Chopin. They all make the same mistakes. They think speed and accuracy are enough. They don't understand that music is about life, about depth of emotion, about experiences they haven't lived yet. She'll be no different. In his mind, he'd already made up his opinion about Maya before she'd played a single note. He'd already decided she'd be another example of youthful enthusiasm without real substance. Another teaching moment for his television audience about the difference between playing notes and making music. What Victor Antonov couldn't know, was that sometimes the teacher learns more than the student. And sometimes the person you underestimate most is exactly the person who'll surprise you. Maya Chen had no idea who Victor Antonov really was. She knew his reputation, of course. Everyone did. But she'd never watched the show before. Her family didn't have cable television, and she'd been too busy practicing to spend time watching videos online. All she knew was that the most respected judge in classical music would be listening to her play, and that terrified her more than anything else in the world. The day of the performance arrived faster than Maya expected. One moment she was practicing in her living room, and the next, she was sitting in the back of a car driving toward the television studio in the city. Her mother had taken the day off work, something she almost never did. She sat beside Maya in the car, holding her hand, not saying much. They were both too nervous for small talk. Maya stared out the window, watching the buildings get taller as they got closer to downtown, her stomach doing flips. The television studio was huge and intimidating. They were greeted by a producer with a headset and clipboard who seemed to be in 17 places at once. Everything moved so fast. Sign this form. Wait here. Follow me. Put your belongings in this room. Makeup is down the hall. You're on in 90 minutes. The makeup room was small and bright, filled with mirrors and lights. A friendly woman dusted powder on Maya's face and added a touch of lipstick. You're so pretty, honey. Don't be nervous. You'll be amazing. Maya tried to smile, but her face felt frozen. She changed into the dress her mother had bought for the occasion. It was simple and black, the most formal thing Maya owned. They'd found it on sale at a department store 2 weeks ago. It wasn't designer or fancy, but it was clean and appropriate. Maya looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the girl staring back. In the holding area backstage, she could hear the show happening on the other side of the curtain. The audience clapping. The host's voice making announcements. Another contestant performing. She couldn't tell if they were good or not. Her own heart was beating too loudly in her ears. A stage manager with a kind face came over. "You're up next, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Maya admitted. The woman laughed gently. "That's normal. But here's a secret. The moment you start playing, all that fear goes away. Your fingers know what to do. Trust them." She squeezed Maya's shoulder. 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes felt like 5 seconds. Suddenly, the stage manager was gesturing to her. "You're on. Go ahead. Walk through that curtain when the host calls your name." Maya's legs felt like water as she heard the host's voice boom through the speakers. "Our next performer is a 17-year-old pianist from a small town who's never lost a regional competition. Please welcome Maya Chen." The applause started and Maya forced her feet to move. One step, another step, through the curtain. And suddenly she was standing on a stage under lights so bright they felt like sunshine. The audience was a dark blur beyond the lights. She couldn't see individual faces, just shapes and movement. But she could see the judges' panel clearly. 3 people sat behind a long desk. 2 of them smiled at her warmly. The third, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, looked completely unimpressed. That was Viktor Antonov. The piano sat in the center of the stage, gleaming black under the spotlights. It was a beautiful instrument, much nicer than her old upright at home. A Steinway grand piano, the kind professionals played in concert halls. Maya walked toward it, her footsteps echoing in the huge space. She sat on the bench and immediately knew something was wrong. The height wasn't quite right. Her feet didn't reach the pedals comfortably. She adjusted it, her hands shaking slightly as she worked the lever. The audience waited in silence. The judges watched. Finally, it felt right. Maya placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. This was it. Everything she'd worked for her entire life came down to the next few minutes. She thought about her mother sitting somewhere in that audience. She thought about Mr. Johnson, her piano teacher who was probably watching from his living room. She thought about all the hours of practice, the sacrificed weekends, the aching fingers, the dreams. Then she began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Etude in C-sharp minor rang out through the studio. Her right hand launched into the rapid chromatic runs that made this piece famous, her fingers flying across the keys at breathtaking speed. Her left hand provided the harmonic foundation, steady and sure. This piece was nicknamed Torrent by musicians because the notes rushed like water cascading down a mountain. It demanded absolute precision. There was nowhere to hide, no way to fake it. Either your fingers could execute the runs cleanly or they couldn't. Either you had the stamina to maintain the intensity for nearly 2 minutes straight, or you didn't. Maya had both. Her fingers knew every note, every pattern, every tiny detail. She'd practiced this piece so many times that it lived in her muscle memory. But it wasn't just mechanical playing. She understood what Chopin was trying to express. The urgency, the emotion, the technical brilliance showing off what a piano could do in the hands of a master. As she played, something magical happened. The fear disappeared completely. The stage manager had been right. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the rest of the world vanished. There was no audience, no judges, no television cameras. There was only the music and Maya and the piano. She navigated through the treacherous passages that made even professional pianists nervous. The wide leaps, the rapid scale runs, the sections where both hands had to work in perfect coordination. Her face showed the intensity of her concentration, but also something else. Joy, pure joy in the act of making music. The piece built to its dramatic conclusion, the final chords ringing out with power and authority. Maya played the last note and lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the studio. Then the audience began to applaud. It wasn't a standing ovation or anything like that, just polite, appreciative applause from people who recognized they'd heard something good. Maya stood up from the piano bench, her heart still racing. She looked toward the judges' panel, expecting to see smiles, nods of approval, maybe even impressed expressions. Two of the judges were indeed smiling. One was writing notes on a pad, nodding her head appreciatively. But Viktor Antonov? He looked bored. No, worse than bored. He looked annoyed, like he'd just wasted 2 minutes of his life listening to something beneath his notice. The host walked onto the stage to stand beside Maya. That was incredible. Let's hear what our judges think. Maestro Antonov, you're our senior judge. What did you think of Maya's performance? This was the moment Maya had been waiting for. The moment that would determine whether all her hard work had been worth it. She stood under those bright lights, her dress sticking slightly to her back from nervous sweat, and waited to hear the words that would either make her dreams come true or break her heart. Viktor Antonov leaned forward in his chair. His expression was cold, and when he opened his mouth to speak, Maya had no idea that she was about to experience the most humiliating moment of her young life. Viktor Antonov didn't even wait for the applause to completely die down. He held up his hand in a gesture that demanded silence, and the audience immediately went quiet. Even the other judges looked at him with anticipation, knowing that whatever came next would set the tone for the entire critique. "Stop, stop, stop," he said, his voice cutting through the studio like a knife. His accent made the words sound even harsher. Please, enough with the polite applause for mediocrity. Maya felt like she'd been slapped. Mediocrity? She'd just played one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire without a single mistake. Her fingers had executed every run perfectly. She'd maintained the tempo throughout. What was he talking about? Viktor stood up from his chair, and suddenly he seemed even more intimidating. He was a tall man, and standing made him tower over the judges' panel. He gestured toward Maya with one hand while addressing the audience. "This," he said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "This is exactly what is wrong with young pianists today. Exactly the problem I see again and again and again." Maya's face started to burn. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. The studio audience, the other judges, the crew members. The cameras capturing every moment of her humiliation for broadcast to the entire nation. "You played the notes," Viktor continued, pacing now, warming up to his subject. "Yes, technically you hit the correct keys in the correct order at approximately the correct tempo. Congratulations. You can read music and move your fingers quickly. So can thousands of other piano students around the world." He turned to look directly at Maya, his sharp eyes boring into her. But where was the music? Where was the soul? Where was the understanding of what Chopin was trying to communicate when he composed this piece? Maya opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to defend herself, to explain her interpretation, but she was frozen under his gaze. "Chopin wrote this etude when he was a young man." "Yes," Viktor said, now addressing the audience again like he was giving a lecture. "But he wrote it after experiencing heartbreak, after understanding loss and passion and the full range of human emotion. This piece isn't just about fingers running up and down the keyboard. It's about the torrent of feelings that overwhelm us when we truly live." He turned back to Maya, and his expression was almost pitying now, which somehow felt worse than anger. "You play like a machine, like a very well-programmed computer that has analyzed the sheet music and reproduced it exactly. But music is not mathematics. Music is not a technical exercise. Music is human emotion translated into sound." The audience sat in uncomfortable silence. Even the host seemed unsure what to do, glancing between Viktor and Maya with an awkward expression. "How old are you?" Viktor asked suddenly. 17. Maya managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. 17. Viktor repeated, nodding as if this confirmed everything he'd been saying. "A child. You play like a child who is very good at mimicking adults. You've copied the style, the technique, the surface elements of great piano playing. But copying is not the same as understanding." He walked a few steps closer to the stage, and Maya unconsciously took a small step backward. "This piece requires depth. It requires life experience. It requires having loved and lost, having felt joy and despair, having lived enough to understand what it means to be human. These are things you clearly do not have." One of the other judges, a middle-aged woman who'd been nodding sympathetically at Maya, tried to interject. "Maestro, perhaps we should—" But Viktor cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No, this is important. This young woman needs to hear the truth. Everyone watching needs to understand the difference between technical proficiency and true artistry. He looked at Maya again, and his voice took on an almost gentle tone which somehow made his words cut even deeper. You have facility on the instrument. This is clear. With many years of training, perhaps you could become a competent piano teacher. Perhaps you could play at local events, maybe even join a regional orchestra if you're very lucky. He paused, and in that pause, Maya felt her entire future crumbling. But concert pianist, soloist, international performer, these dreams require not just fingers that can move quickly. They require a soul that can move audiences. And I'm sorry to tell you this, my dear, but I don't believe you have that. The camera zoomed in on Maya's face, capturing the moment her eyes began to well up with tears. She bit her lip hard, determined not to cry on national television. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction, but her eyes betrayed her, becoming glossy and red-rimmed. Your posture is incorrect, Victor continued, now nitpicking every detail of her performance. You sit too rigidly, like you're afraid of the piano instead of in conversation with it. Your use of the pedal is pedestrian at best, and your interpretation, your artistic choices, they are safe and boring and exactly what I would expect from someone who learned piano from YouTube videos and local competitions. That last part stung especially hard because it wasn't entirely untrue. Maya had taught herself initially. She'd watched countless videos online. She'd learned from regional teachers who were good but not world-class. She'd done the best she could with the resources available to her. Perhaps, Victor said, returning to his seat at the judges' panel, perhaps you should return to this stage in 10 years, after you've actually lived, after you've experienced something real in your life besides living room practice sessions and high school drama. Come back when you have something to say through your music, not just notes to play. The other two judges looked distinctly uncomfortable. One of them started to say something positive about Maya's technical ability, but it felt hollow after Victor's devastating critique. The damage was done. Everyone knew that Victor Antonov's opinion was the only one that really mattered on this show. The host tried to salvage the moment, thanking Maya for her performance and encouraging the audience to give her another round of applause. But the applause was thin and pitying. People clapped because they felt bad for her, not because they were impressed. Maya stood there for a moment longer, completely shell-shocked. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She'd prepared for months. She'd played perfectly. She'd given everything she had, and it still wasn't enough. According to Victor Antonov, she would never be enough. As she turned to walk off the stage, her legs felt shaky. Each step felt impossible. The bright light suddenly felt too hot, too intense. She could feel the cameras following her, documenting her walk of shame. Somewhere in that audience, her mother was watching, probably crying for her. Maya made it to the backstage area before the first sob escaped her throat. A production assistant tried to comfort her, but Maya barely heard the words. All she could hear was Victor's voice echoing in her head. Mediocrity. Like a machine. You play like a child. You don't have that. She'd been humiliated in front of millions of people. Her dreams had been crushed by someone whose opinion carried weight in the entire classical music world. Conservatories would see this episode. Other judges would see it. Teachers and conductors and everyone who mattered would see Victor Antonov tearing apart her performance and her potential. But then, in that moment of absolute despair and humiliation, something unexpected happened. The sadness Maya felt began to transform into something else. Something hotter and more powerful. Anger. Not the explosive kind, but the cold, determined kind. The kind that makes you want to prove someone wrong more than anything else in the world. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. Her breathing slowed, and a thought formed in her mind, clear and sharp as a blade. If Victor Antonov thought she was just a child playing at being a musician, if he thought she had no depth or soul or understanding, then maybe it was time to show him exactly what she could do. Maya turned around and walked back toward the stage. The production assistant called after Maya as she walked back toward the stage. Wait, honey, where are you going? The next performer is about to go on. But Maya didn't stop. Her feet carried her forward with a certainty she didn't entirely understand. She just knew that she couldn't leave things like this. She couldn't let Victor Antonov's words be the final statement on her performance, on her years of work, on her dreams. She pushed through the curtain and walked back onto the stage. The audience gasped. This wasn't normal. Contestants didn't come back after their segment ended. The host looked confused, glancing toward the producers in the wings who were frantically gesturing at each other trying to figure out what to do. Viktor Antonov was mid-conversation with the other judges when he noticed the commotion. He looked up and saw Maya standing there in the spotlight again. His eyebrows raised in surprise, then drew together in annoyance. "I'm sorry," the host said into his microphone, trying to regain control of the situation. "But I think our previous performer wants to say something?" Maya walked to the center of the stage. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every instinct told her to turn around, to leave, to not make this worse. But a stronger instinct pushed her forward. The instinct to fight for herself, to stand up for all the hours she'd practiced, for her mother's sacrifices, for every young musician who'd ever been told they weren't good enough. She looked directly at Viktor Antonov, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Maestro Antonov, I want to say something." "This is highly irregular," Viktor said, looking at the producers. "We have a schedule to keep." "It'll just take a minute," Maya said, her voice growing stronger. The audience had gone completely silent. You could hear a pin drop in that massive studio. Viktor sighed dramatically and gestured for her to continue. "Very well. What is it?" Maya took a breath. "I respect your experience and your expertise. You've accomplished things in music that I can only dream about. You've conducted the greatest orchestras in the world. You've worked with legendary musicians. Your knowledge is vast and your ear is trained by decades of study." Viktor's expression softened slightly. Perhaps he thought she was about to apologize or thank him for his harsh but supposedly helpful criticism. "But," Maya continued, and that one word made Viktor's eyes narrow again, "I wonder if you remember what it's like to actually play." A murmur rippled through the audience. The other judges exchanged shocked glances. No one challenged Viktor Antonov. It simply wasn't done. "What exactly are you implying?" Viktor's voice had turned ice cold. Maya's hands were shaking, but she clasped them together to steady herself. "I'm not implying anything, Maestro. I'm asking a genuine question. You've spent the last 10 minutes explaining everything that was wrong with my performance. You said I played without soul, without understanding, without depth." She paused, and in that pause she made a decision that would change everything. "So I'm wondering if you could show me. Show all of us how it should be done." The studio erupted. The audience gasped and started whispering to each other. The host's jaw literally dropped. The other judges looked like they'd just witnessed someone jump off a cliff. The production crew backstage started talking urgently into their headsets. Viktor Antonov sat perfectly still, his face turning red. For a moment Maya thought he might explode with anger, but then his expression shifted into something else. Wounded pride mixed with indignation. "You are challenging me?" He said it slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "You, a 17-year-old girl who just gave a mediocre performance, are challenging me to play?" Maya's voice didn't waver. "I'm asking you to demonstrate what you mean. You said my interpretation was wrong, that I don't understand the piece. So show me the right way. Play it yourself, Maestro. Show everyone watching what Chopin's Etude should really sound like when performed with proper depth and soul and understanding." The other judges looked absolutely terrified. One of them leaned toward Viktor and whispered urgently, "You don't have to do this. This is ridiculous. We should just move on to the next performer." But Viktor wasn't listening to them. He was staring at Maya with an expression that was hard to read. Anger, certainly, but also something else. He was trapped, and he knew it. The cameras were rolling. The audience was watching. Millions of people would see this episode. If he refused, he would look like a coward, like someone who could criticize but not perform, like someone whose harsh words came from a place of bitterness rather than expertise. His entire reputation was built on being the ultimate authority, the person whose understanding of music was beyond question. But if he accepted the challenge, he would be put on the spot in a way he hadn't anticipated. He'd come to the show today expecting to judge others, not to perform himself. He hadn't warmed up, hadn't prepared, hadn't planned to play a single note. The studio was absolutely silent, waiting for his response. The host stood frozen with his microphone, unsure whether to intervene or let this drama play out. The producers in the control booth were probably having heart attacks, but they were also probably thrilled. This was the kind of unscripted television moment that people talked about for years. Finally, Viktor stood up. He straightened his jacket with sharp, angry movements. When he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Fine. If this is what it takes to show you the difference between amateur playing and professional artistry, then so be it. He pointed at Maya. But understand this. When I play that piano and demonstrate what real music sounds like, you will see exactly what I meant. You will understand how far you have to go. You will realize that criticism isn't cruelty. It's truth, Maya nodded. I understand, Maestro. I'm ready to learn. Victor walked toward the piano with confident, measured steps. But if you watched carefully, if you paid close attention, you might have noticed something. His hands, hanging at his sides, were clenched into fists, and there was the slightest tremor in his fingers. Maya stepped back to give him space, moving to the side of the stage. Her heart was racing. What had she just done? She'd challenged one of the most respected musicians in the world to a direct comparison. If he played beautifully, if he demonstrated that her performance really was inferior, she would look foolish. Worse than foolish. Arrogant and delusional, but something in her gut told her to trust her instincts. Something in the way he'd criticized her felt off, like he was tearing her down not because she'd played badly, but because he needed to maintain his position of superiority. Like maybe, just maybe, the great Victor Antonov wasn't quite as untouchable as he wanted everyone to believe. The maestro sat at the piano bench. He adjusted it slightly, taking his time, building the tension. The audience waited with bated breath. This was unprecedented. They were about to hear one of the world's most famous conductors play one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. Victor placed his hands on the keys. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. Then he looked up at the audience with a confident smile. Now, he said, I will show you what this piece truly requires. And he began to play. Victor Antonov's first notes rang out through the studio with authority and power. His opening was strong, commanding, full of the confidence that came from decades of musical training and performance. He attacked the keys with precision, his fingers moving across them with the muscle memory of a lifetime spent around pianos. The audience leaned forward in their seats. This was what they'd come to see. This was the master at work. Surely this would show everyone what he'd meant in his criticism of Maya. Surely his performance would justify his harsh words. For the first 30 seconds, Victor's playing was impressive. He brought a different interpretation to the piece than Maya had, one that emphasized the dramatic elements, the grand gestures. His left hand hammered out the bass notes with theatrical force while his right hand began the ascending runs. But then something started to happen. Something subtle at first, but growing more noticeable with each passing measure. The tempo began to slow down, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that anyone with a trained ear could hear it. Victor was supposed to be playing at a rapid, almost breathless pace. That's what made Chopin's Etude No. 4 so challenging. It was nicknamed Torrent, because the notes were supposed to cascade like rushing water, never letting up, never giving the pianist a moment to rest. But Victor was giving himself moments to rest. His fingers couldn't quite maintain the speed that the piece demanded. He'd play a run, then slow down slightly before the next one, catching his breath, resetting his hands. Maya watched from the side of the stage, her eyes wide. She'd practiced this piece so many times that she knew every note, every phrase, every technical challenge, and she could see Victor struggling with those challenges. Around the 1-minute mark, things got worse. There's a section in the etude where both hands have to work in perfect coordination, executing rapid chromatic runs while maintaining absolute clarity. Each note needed to be distinct, crisp, separate from the others. This was the section that had taken Maya months to master. Victor's fingers started to fumble. The notes became muddy, running together in a way that any serious pianist would recognize as a technical failure. He pushed through, his face tightening with concentration and effort. Sweat began to form on his forehead under the hot stage lights. The other judges exchanged glances. They could hear it too. This wasn't going well. The audience, many of whom weren't trained musicians, might not have caught all the technical errors, but they could sense something was off. The confidence Victor had projected at the beginning was cracking. Victor's breathing became audible, heavy and labored. His shoulders tensed up, rising toward his ears in a way that any piano teacher would immediately correct. Tension is the enemy of piano playing. It makes your fingers slow, your movements stiff, your sound harsh. He reached the section that Maya had executed flawlessly, a passage of rapid scales that spanned the entire keyboard. Victor's hands tried to fly across the keys, but they couldn't keep up with what the music demanded. Notes were missed. The rhythm became uneven. His left hand and right hand fell out of sync with each other. And then came the moment everyone would talk about afterward. The moment that would be replayed on social media thousands of times. The moment that would define this entire episode. There's a particularly treacherous passage about 2/3 of the way through the piece. It requires extraordinary finger independence, with the fourth and fifth fingers of the right hand executing rapid movements while the thumb and first two fingers do something completely different. It's the kind of passage that separates amateur pianists from professionals. Victor approached this passage and his hands simply locked up. His fingers froze mid-movement, unable to execute what the music required. He tried to push through to force his fingers to move, but they wouldn't cooperate. The notes came out as a jumbled mess, nothing like the clean, precise runs that Chopin had written. He stopped playing. Just stopped, his hands hovering over the keys, his chest heaving with exertion. The silence that followed was deafening. The audience didn't know what to do. Should they clap? Should they stay quiet? This was Victor Antonov, the man who just spent 10 minutes destroying a teenager's performance. And now he couldn't even finish the piece he'd criticized her for playing. Victor sat at the piano for a moment longer, his face flushed red, not just from effort, but from embarrassment and anger. His jaw clenched. His hands slowly lowered from the keyboard to his lap. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at the other judges. He certainly didn't look at Maya. The piano, he said finally, his voice strained, is not properly adjusted. The action is too heavy. The keys are sticking. He stood up from the bench quickly, almost stumbling, and gestured dismissively at the instrument. This is not a proper concert piano. I cannot work with substandard equipment. But everyone in that studio knew the truth. They'd all just heard Maya play that exact same piano 20 minutes ago. And she'd played it beautifully. The piano was fine. The instrument wasn't the problem. One of the other judges, the woman who'd tried to defend Maya earlier, spoke carefully. Maestro, that was... Well, I think we can all agree that Chopin's Etude No. 4 is an extremely challenging piece, even for the most accomplished pianists. She was trying to give him an out, a way to save face, but Victor wasn't ready to accept any excuses, even sympathetic ones. I haven't played piano regularly in years, he snapped, walking back toward the judges' panel. My focus has been on conducting, on working with entire orchestras. The piano is not my primary instrument anymore. The host, finally finding his voice again, tried to smooth over the awkward situation. Well, that was certainly an interesting demonstration. Very enlightening for all of us. I think we can all appreciate the difficulty of this piece now, but the damage was done. The great Victor Antonov, the man who made contestants cry with his harsh criticisms, the man who held himself up as the ultimate authority on musical interpretation and performance, had just failed spectacularly at the very piece he'd criticized a teenager for playing. Maya stood at the edge of the stage, still in shock at what she'd just witnessed. Part of her felt vindicated. Part of her felt almost sorry for the maestro, who clearly hadn't expected to be put in this position. But mostly she felt something else. A quiet, growing confidence, because here's what Maya understood in that moment. Victor Antonov had spent his entire career, his entire reputation, on being the person who judged others. He'd become so comfortable in that role, so used to tearing down other people's performances, that he'd forgotten what it actually felt like to be in the vulnerable position of the performer. He'd forgotten what it was, like to sit at a piano under bright lights with cameras pointed at you and hundreds of eyes watching your every move. He'd forgotten the courage it took to get up on stage and put yourself out there, knowing you might fail, knowing you might be criticized, but doing it anyway because you loved music more than you feared judgment. And most importantly, he'd forgotten that criticizing was easy. Anyone could sit in a chair and point out flaws, but actually doing the thing, actually performing at the highest level, that was hard. That required not just knowledge but skill, not just understanding but execution. The audience was still quiet, unsure how to react. The producers were probably screaming in their control booth, either in horror or excitement or both. This was not at all what anyone had expected to happen today. Maya took a breath and made another decision. She walked back to the center of the stage, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Everyone's eyes turned to her. Victor looked up sharply, his expression wary and angry. "May I?" Maya asked quietly, gesturing toward the piano. The host looked confused. "May you what?" Maya's voice was steady and clear. "May I play something?" For a moment, nobody moved. Maya's request hung in the air like a held breath. The host looked toward the producers in the wings who were frantically gesturing at each other, trying to decide what to do. This was already the most chaotic episode in the show's history. Should they let it continue? But before anyone could officially respond, Maya was already walking toward the piano. There was something different about her now. The nervous, shaking girl who'd performed earlier was gone. In her place was someone who'd just realized her own power. Viktor Antonov stood up from his seat at the judges' panel. "This is absurd. We cannot just let contestants do whatever they want. There are rules, there's a format. Let her play," the female judge interrupted, her voice firm. "I want to hear what she has to say." The other judge nodded in agreement. "We've already thrown out the format anyway. Let's see where this goes." Viktor looked like he wanted to argue, but he was outnumbered. He sat back down heavily, his arms crossed over his chest, his face set in a scowl. Maya reached the piano and sat down on the bench. She didn't adjust it this time. She didn't fidget or hesitate. She simply placed her hands on the keys and looked out at the audience for a brief moment. Somewhere in that darkness, her mother was watching. That thought gave her strength. "This piece," Maya said, addressing the audience directly, "is called La Campanella. It was written by Franz Liszt, and it's considered one of the most technically difficult pieces in the entire piano repertoire." A murmur went through the audience. Even people who didn't know classical music had often heard of La Campanella. It was famous for being nearly impossible to play. Professional pianists approached it with caution and respect. It was a piece that separated good pianists from great ones. Victor's expression shifted from anger to something else. Concern, worry, because he knew what Maya was doing. She wasn't just playing another piece. She was throwing down a gauntlet. If he'd struggled with Chopin's Etude, which was difficult but manageable for a trained pianist, then La Campanella would be absolutely brutal. Maya didn't say anything else. She didn't explain her choice or justify it. She simply began to play. The piece opened with those famous bell-like notes that gave it its name. La Campanella meant the little bell in Italian, and the opening passages were supposed to sound like bells ringing across a valley. Maya's fingers struck the keys with perfect clarity, each note distinct and pure, and then the piece took off into the stratosphere. La Campanella was written by Liszt to showcase his own extraordinary abilities as a pianist. He was known as one of the greatest piano virtuosos who ever lived, and he wrote pieces that only he could play properly. La Campanella was one of those pieces. It required enormous leaps across the keyboard, rapid octaves, trills, scales that spanned multiple octaves, and sections where the hands had to cross over each other in seemingly impossible ways. Maya played it all. Her fingers flew across the keys with breathtaking speed and precision. The enormous leaps that caused many pianists to miss notes, Maya hit them perfectly, her hands flying through the air and landing exactly where they needed to be. The rapid, repeated notes that required incredible finger strength and endurance, she executed them with ease, never losing clarity or speed. But it wasn't just technical ability on display. Maya was making music, real music that told a story and evoked emotion. She understood that La Campanella wasn't just about showing off. It was about joy, about playfulness, about the pure delight of what a piano could do in skilled hands. She smiled slightly as she played, her face showing both intense concentration and genuine happiness. This was what she loved. Not the competition, not the judgment, not even the applause. Just the act of making music, of bringing something beautiful into the world through her fingers and this instrument. The audience was transfixed. People who'd been checking their phones put them away. People who'd been whispering to their neighbors fell silent. Everyone watched Maya's hands dance across the keyboard, executing passages that seemed physically impossible. The other two judges were leaning forward in their seats, their mouths slightly open. They were accomplished musicians themselves, and they understood exactly what they were witnessing. This wasn't just good playing. This was exceptional playing. This was the kind of talent that came along once in a generation. And Victor sat absolutely still, his face drained of color. He was watching his entire reputation crumble in real time. Because here was this 17-year-old girl, this child he'd dismissed and humiliated, playing a piece that was infinitely more difficult than the one he'd failed to complete. And she wasn't just playing it. She was mastering it. The piece built to its climactic ending, a series of cascading scales and arpeggios that culminated in triumphant final chords. Maya struck those final notes with perfect authority, letting them ring out through the studio before lifting her hands from the keys. For 3 full seconds there was absolute silence. Then the studio exploded with sound. The audience erupted into applause, but not the polite, obligatory applause from earlier. This was genuine, enthusiastic, standing ovation applause. People jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some were even whistling. The other 2 judges stood up immediately, applauding vigorously, huge smiles on their faces. The camera crew, who were supposed to stay professional and detached, were clapping too. The host was grinning from ear to ear, shaking his head in disbelief. Even the producers in the control booth were probably losing their minds. This was television gold, an unscripted moment that would be talked about for years. Maya stood up from the piano bench and faced the audience. Her eyes were bright, not with tears this time, but with something else. Pride, not arrogant pride, but the quiet pride of someone who'd just proven their worth in the most definitive way possible. She looked at Viktor Antonov. He was the only person in the entire studio who wasn't applauding. He sat in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests, his face a mask of controlled fury and humiliation. Their eyes met, and in that moment an entire conversation happened without words. Maya didn't gloat. She didn't smile smugly or say, "I told you so." She simply looked at him with calm dignity, as if to say, "You thought you could judge me? You thought you knew what I was capable of? You were wrong." The host finally managed to compose himself enough to speak into his microphone. I don't even have words. That was absolutely incredible. "Maya Chen, everybody." The applause started up again, even louder this time. The female judge was wiping tears from her eyes, genuinely moved by what she'd witnessed. The male judge was shaking his head in amazement, mouthing, "Wow," to himself. Maya gave a small bow to the audience, then walked off the stage with her head held high. This time when she left, it wasn't in defeat and humiliation. It was in triumph. She'd come to this show as a nervous teenager, hoping for validation from people she admired. She was leaving as someone who'd learned that she didn't need their validation. She had her own. Behind her on the stage she was leaving, Viktor Antonov remained frozen in his seat. The great maestro, humbled on live television by a 17-year-old girl with a scratched-up piano at home, and a mother who worked double shifts. The irony was perfect. He'd told Maya she played like a machine without soul or understanding. But in the end, he was the one who couldn't execute the technical requirements. He was the one whose hands failed him, and she was the one who'd shown everyone what real mastery looked like. The show cut to commercial break, but the damage was already done. Or rather, the revelation was already complete. Everyone watching now understood what Maya had understood all along. Criticism is easy. Performance is hard. And sometimes the people who judge most harshly are the ones who've forgotten what it's like to actually do the thing they're judging. The episode aired 2 weeks later on a Tuesday night. Maya tried not to watch it, but her mother insisted they sit together on their worn couch, the television showing the same performance that had already changed their lives before anyone else even saw it. By Wednesday morning, the clip was everywhere. Someone in the audience had recorded Maya's performance of La Campanella on their phone and posted it online. Within hours, it had thousands of views. By the end of the day, millions. By the end of the week, it was approaching 20 million views and counting. The comment sections exploded. People around the world were talking about the teenager who'd challenged a famous maestro and then proceeded to play one of the most difficult piano pieces in existence. The video had been shared, reposted, discussed, analyzed, and celebrated across every social media platform imaginable. News outlets picked up the story. Teen pianist silences harsh critic with stunning. Performance. Maestro's cruelty backfires when young performer proves her worth. The piano battle that's captivating the internet. It wasn't just music websites covering it. Major news networks were running segments about Maya Chen and what her story meant for arts education, for mentorship, for how we treat young talent. Maya's phone never stopped ringing. Her email inbox filled with hundreds of messages every hour. Scholarship offers from prestigious music conservatories around the world. Invitations to perform with major symphony orchestras. Requests for interviews from magazines and television programs. Messages of support from established musicians, some of them names Maya had admired her entire life. One email came from a pianist she'd always looked up to, someone who'd won international competitions and performed at the world's most famous concert halls. "I've been in your shoes," the email read. "I've faced critics who tried to break my spirit. But you did something I never had the courage to do. You stood up for yourself and you did it with grace and strength. The classical music world needs more people like you. Please don't let anyone dim your light ever again." But the responses weren't all positive. The classical music community was divided. Some people celebrated Maya's courage and defended her right to stand up against unfair criticism. But others thought she'd been disrespectful, that challenging a maestro of Viktor Antonov's stature showed a lack of humility and proper respect for hierarchy and experience. Online forums dedicated to classical music debated endlessly. Was Maya right to challenge him? Was Viktor's criticism actually valid even if his performance wasn't good? Does being able to perform well mean you're better qualified to judge than someone who teaches or conducts? The discussions went on and on, thousands of comments arguing every possible angle. Viktor Antonov himself stayed mostly silent for the first week. His publicist issued a brief statement that was so carefully worded it said almost nothing at all. Maestro Antonov acknowledges that technical ability and age are not always directly correlated. He wishes the young performer well in her future endeavors. No apology, no admission that he'd been wrong. Just a cold, distant statement that technically acknowledged Maya's skill while giving away nothing of his actual feelings. But his silence spoke volumes. For someone who'd built his reputation on being outspoken and brutally honest, suddenly having nothing to say was itself a statement. Some of his supporters in the classical music world tried to defend him. They argued that his role was to be a teacher, a critic, not a performer. They pointed out his decades of accomplishments, his contributions to classical music, his work with world-class orchestras. They said that one failed piano performance didn't erase a lifetime of achievement, and they weren't entirely wrong. Viktor Antonov really had accomplished remarkable things in his career. He'd conducted performances that people still talked about decades later. He'd helped shape the development of countless musicians. His understanding of music theory and interpretation was genuinely profound. But none of that justified cruelty. None of that made it okay to humiliate a 17-year-old girl on national television. And none of it changed the fact that he'd failed to complete the very piece he'd criticized her for playing perfectly. The show's producers were thrilled with the attention, even though it was chaotic. Ratings for Masters of Music skyrocketed. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Would Viktor continue as a judge? Would Maya ever appear on the show again? The drama had turned their moderately successful program into must-see television. But behind the scenes, there were difficult conversations happening. Several former contestants came forward with their own stories about Viktor's harsh treatment. They talked about how his words had affected them, how some had quit music entirely after being torn apart on the show, how the culture of fear and humiliation had damaged their confidence and their love for performing. A conversation started to shift in the broader music education community. Teachers and professors began writing articles about the difference between constructive criticism and destructive criticism. They questioned whether the old-school approach of breaking students down was really necessary, or if it was just a tradition of hurt people hurting people. "We can teach excellence without cruelty," one famous violin teacher wrote in a widely shared essay. "We can demand high standards without destroying the spirit of young artists." Maya Chen's story should be a wake-up call for all of us in music education. How many brilliant talents have we lost because someone told them they weren't good enough in a way that crushed their soul, rather than motivated them to improve? As for Maya, her life had transformed overnight, but not always in comfortable ways. She couldn't go to school without people staring at her or wanting to talk about the video. Her social media accounts, which she'd barely used before, were now flooded with followers and comments. Some supportive, some critical, some just weird. The attention was overwhelming. She was just 17 years old, still living in the same small apartment, still dealing with homework and friend drama, and all the normal things teenagers dealt with. Except now she was also somehow a symbol of standing up to authority, a viral sensation, a topic of debate in music circles around the world. Her mother worried about her constantly. "Are you okay with all of this?" she asked one evening as they sat together at their small kitchen table. I know this isn't what you expected when you went on that show. Maya thought about it carefully. I'm okay, she said finally. It's strange and sometimes it's too much. But I don't regret what I did. I don't regret standing up for myself. I'm proud of you, her mother said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. Not because you played beautifully, though you did, but because you showed courage. Because you knew your worth and you didn't let anyone take that away from you. The scholarship offers kept coming, and eventually Maya had to make some decisions. She chose a prestigious conservatory on the East Coast, one that had a reputation for nurturing talent rather than breaking spirits. They offered her a full scholarship, covering tuition, room, board, everything. Her mother wouldn't have to work double shifts anymore just to support Maya's dreams. Mr. Johnson, her longtime piano teacher, threw her a small party in his living room. All her former music teachers came and some of her friends from school. He gave a short speech, his voice cracking with emotion. I've taught piano for over 40 years, he said. I've had hundreds of students, but Maya is special. Not just because of her fingers or her ear or her technical skills. She's special because she has something that can't be taught. Dignity, courage, the strength to stand up for herself and for what she believes in. That's rarer than musical talent, and it's more important. Maya also received invitations to perform with orchestras and at concert halls. She accepted some of them. Carefully chosen appearances that wouldn't interfere too much with her studies. Each time she performed, concert halls sold out. People came not just to hear her play, but to see the girl from the video, the teenager who'd stood up to the famous maestro, and she never disappointed. She played with the same combination of technical brilliance and emotional honesty that she'd shown on that television stage. She was proving, performance after performance, that she was the real deal, not just a viral moment, but a genuinely gifted musician with a long career ahead of her. One day, about 6 months after the episode aired, Maya received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten, on expensive stationery, and it came from Viktor Antonov. She stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of her wanted to throw it away without reading it, but curiosity won. She carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was short. Miss Chen, it began, I have spent 50 years in music, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about talent, about teaching, about what makes a great musician. Watching you perform that day taught me that I still have things to learn. You were right to challenge me. I was wrong in how I spoke to you. This doesn't come easily to an old man set in his ways, but I owe you an apology. You are an exceptional talent, and more than that, you are a person of remarkable character. I wish you every success in your career. V. Antonov. Maya read the letter 3 times. It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't undo what had happened or make why